If you are enjoying this podcast and other podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon Shop. Awesome t-shirts and mugs from your favorite shows so you can tout your podcast pride, all while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. And make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com and get your dragon swag on. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers, to another fun episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Today we have a very enticing episode. Our special guest is president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, John Hamill. John has a master's degree in historical geography, and he has also published and presented many scholarly papers for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, both in our monthly newsletter as well as live at our annual conferences. And we're pleased to welcome John to the program today to discuss a very enticing topic, and that is the sexuality of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Welcome to the program, John.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for having me on.
We're so glad to have you here today. This is a great topic, and it's one that we have addressed mildly in previous episodes, but I felt like it was time to really dive into this because there are so many different beliefs and theories about Oxford's sexuality, about the lovers he may or may not have had. We do know that he was quite promiscuous, including fathering at least one bastard child in his lifetime. And so let's dive into what we know about the man and his desires, shall we?
Sure. Like you said, this is a very controversial subject, something that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and all Oxfordians discuss as to the reasons as to why was the secret kept after Oxford died. And that's a big issue because back then it was not proper or respectable or customary for noblemen to write anything under their own names, especially if it was drama. Drama was considered the lowest form of art. It wasn't considered art at all. So you could write poetry anonymously and then maybe have it published under your name after you died. That was okay, but not while you were alive. But with plays, no, that was just something beneath dignity. Playhouses in London were outside the city limits of London, with the whorehouses and the dog fights and the bear baiting. Queen Elizabeth and King James never went to a public playhouse. All the plays they saw were at court. So that's part of the reason for this. And so the question that we have here goes back to why was it kept a secret after Oxford died?
Well, and there are a lot of people who have theories that some of the reasoning behind the anonymous writing and behind the maintaining of that secret has to do with the scandal of Oxford's life. And one of those scandals may or may not have included the fact that he was either homosexual or bisexual. And so I'd like to talk about what your beliefs are and what you've studied with regards to that issue.
Yeah, actually there are two main theories. One's whether his sexuality has something to do with the secrecy, or was it because he was the bastard son of the queen? Those are two major contending theories. It could be something in between all of them. A lot of people think, he was bisexual and the son of the queen. That explains. So they kind of combine both theories too. I've heard that said before. But in terms of Oxford's life, he, like you said, he has mistresses, he has married twice, and he actually had two illegitimate children, but one died. One was born, one was a miscarriage, so he could have had two, but one survived. That was Edward Vere. And so that's part of the issue there. And the plays, in terms of the Oxford sexuality, the plays demonstrate consistently, play after play after play. And that's what my article is about on Shakespeare Sexuality, and which came out in 2005, which, by the way, same year as Hank Whitmer's book, The Monument, came out also in 2005. So the two competing theories came out at the same time. That is demonstrated that, whoever the author was, and this is not really disputed by most Orthodox scholars who don't think Oxford was the author. They think Shakespeare or Stratford was the author. They recognize time and time again that Oxford the author was interested in bisexual themes. And as I said, therefore, the question is, was the author bisexual? And since they all point to man from Stratford as being the author, I said, well, it's an unknown quantity because we don't know Shakespeare, Stratford's sexuality. So what does all this mean? But if we put Oxford in as the author, then everything falls into place.
Well, I think the topic of sexuality is one of those areas when you think about how it overlays with the topic of pseudonymous writing, in that it was one of those big secrets that everybody knew. There have been, and we know this now through many historical studies and many scholarly studies, about a lot of members of court throughout English history that were definitely bisexual, in some cases very specifically homosexual. There are stories about, for instance, William of Orange, much later than Oxford's life, but that's a really prominent one. William of Orange marries Mary Stuart. We get William and Mary College from those two, as a matter of fact, but they never had any children together. And it's pretty clear that William of Orange was homosexual. He brought a lover with him from the Netherlands to England when he became King of England. So there's just one prime example. There are many other examples throughout history, especially among the royalty. Many people would say Richard II is a great example of, at the very minimum, a bisexual king, and most likely more prone to homosexuality. And these were things that people knew about, they whispered about. They were these known secrets, not unlike many of the affairs and nefarious relationships that went on between husbands and wives back in those days as well. Everybody was sleeping with everybody pretty much. And one of the big rules was just don't get someone pregnant and have evidence or proof that you've actually conducted an illicit affair. And that happened to Oxford, right? With his lover, Anne Vavasour, and one of the Queen's ladies in waiting. She gets pregnant. It's Oxford's baby, and they end up in the Tower.
Correct. Yeah, actually, we don't have to go too far out of Oxford's lifetime to express what you just said. King James, during Oxford's lifetime, had several male favorites while he was married and had children. And everybody at court knew about that. And he, one of his lovers, the Duke of Buckingham, talk about just outrageous behavior. So that was pretty, that was common. So that's the thing, is that this scandal had to be kept under control, but also wasn't such a vile thing to keep after his death. So why would it still be kept after his death? And the sonnets say that there's a scandal going on, and woe me, and I'm just don't talk to me. People know about our situation, the scandal, and so the question is, and this is something I learned then from Alexander Waugh. Alexander Waugh is the British leader of the Vere Society in England, and he came up, I think, with the discovery that the sonnets provide not just the homosexuality involved and the bisexuality, because we have the fair youth and we have the dark lady. So he presents very, very convincingly that the dark lady was Penelope Rich, not Queen Elizabeth. And so, but we go back to the sonnets. The sonnets are 154 sonnets. The first 17 sonnets talk about, a lot of people call them marriage sonnets, because he's asking the fair youth to have a child for him. But he never mentions the word marriage in any of those 17 sonnets. It's all really procreation sonnets. There should be more appropriate called the procreation sonnets. There's no mention of marriage. He just wants him to have a baby. and then sonnet 18 changes. And sonnet 18 seems like the child has been born, the birth of a son, and that could be interpreted that way. And so sonnet 18 could be parallel with the 18th Earl of Oxford was born. Anyway, so that's Alexander Watt's theory. Also, this situation, the first 17 sonnets talk about the question is when were the sonnets written, which really determines what we're talking about. If we're talking about Oxford's life or not. And that's another big issue, when were the sonnets written. But the sonnets say, in sonnet number 2, basically says, I turned 40, 40 winters. Basically, Oxford was 40 in the year 1590. In the year 1590, Oxford turned 17. So it all kind of matches that the 17th first sonnet about Southampton could have been then started in 1590, and Oxford was 1590 and sonnet 40 years old in 1590. So it all kind of matches. But again, this is still speculation there. So the question is then, what is the scandal that has to be suppressed even after Oxford's death? Because when Oxford died, Southampton was still alive. So he would not want people to know that Oxford was the author, writing love sonnets to him. But also, so was Penelope Rich. So that it really in the benefit of the families involved to suppress this news, because it would ruin them socially, not just because of the homosexual part, because of the bastardy part of having this 18th Earl of Oxford being the son of Southampton and Penelope.
Okay, but during Oxford's lifetime, not only was he imprisoned for having an illicit affair with one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, Anne Vavasour, and they have a child together, a bastard child. And in fact, the poor woman has to give birth to the child in the Tower of London because they're all imprisoned in there at that time by the Queen, who was just livid that Oxford had fallen in love with one of her ladies in waiting. But also during his lifetime, Oxford was accused of sodomy before the court and had to answer to charges of sodomy, which at the time was a horrendous crime. And there's the irony, right? Like, we know that everyone knew that certain members of court and certain members of the nobility were homosexual. But if you were accused of it in front of the court, now it was a whole nother story. Now it was a scandal. And now you had to defend yourself and prove that you were not engaging in this illicit activity that was technically illegal at the time.
That is correct. And that is remarkable that nothing further happened to Oxford after the accusation came out. And like you said, he had a illegitimate child with Anne Vavasour, and they were in prison for about 2-3 months. I can't remember a period of months, and then they were released. But they didn't suffer any repercussions from it in the long run. Edward Vere, the bastard son, became a famous military person, so he had a successful life. But Oxford, he, like you said, he was accused of sodomy by his cousin and a friend in front of the Queen and the Privy Council, and they named numerous boys with names. They had names for them, as to these are the people he sodomized. And then one of them was Cuoco, I forgot his first name, who Oxford brought from Italy. Oxford went to Italy for about a year. And when he came back, by that time he was 26 years old, and then he brought back as a souvenir from Italy a 16-year-old choir boy, a beautiful choir boy, as a souvenir. I mean, what 26-year-old man would bring back from Italy a 16-year-old boy? And then he lived with him at his home in London for a year, when he was separated from his wife, because he had a big fight with his wife because of the issue of whether the child that she had was his or not. So he lived with this kid for a year in London without his wife. And then when the kid came back to Italy, he was questioned by the Inquisition in Venice as to what happened in England. Why were you there? But the Inquisition was only concerned about his religion. Did you eat fish on Fridays? Did you go to a Catholic church? Did they try to convert you to the false religion? That's all they were concerned about. They never asked him about anything about sex at all. And he didn't offer any information about any kind of sexual activities he may have had with Oxford. So the focus even then was just on his religious activities while he was living with Oxford.
But wasn't the boy questioned in England when it came down to Oxford being accused of sodomy? Didn't they question the boy, and the boy claimed that there was no physical relationship between them at all, that it was just a mentoring relationship, and that it had nothing to do with sexuality?
I don't remember that. Is that who? Because what I was seeing was the questioning Cuoco in Venice. He was also questioned in England. I don't recall.
That's what I believe. I could be wrong on that. We'll get some emails and
I don't recall.
We'll get emails and phone calls about that one, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure, because I just don't recall that, but that could have happened. But in any case, if you're asked, if you're 16, 17 years old, you said that you have homosexual relationships with the Earl, what are you going to say? Of course you're going to say no, because that implicate you too. So, because he lived with him for a year. So actually, I think it was 11 months. Anyway, so again, he did bring him for a year to live with him in England, and then he was accused of also having affairs with other boys that worked for Oxford, according to his cousin and his friend. But again, those charges did not go anywhere.
He sponsored several acting troupes that were what were called the boys' companies. Yeah. They were companies of young boys, and probably quite often those boy companies were used to train the actors who were going to eventually go on to play leading female roles, because of course everyone knows at that time women were not allowed on the stage, and so you needed young, effeminate males who could conceivably and feasibly, realistically play females on the stage. And so he had several boy companies throughout his lifetime. And of course, that's part of what led to some of these accusations, was that he was messing around with some of these young boys. In fact, ultimately, what it comes down to is he was being accused of being a pedophile.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the director or whatever of the boys acting company was fairly known to have been homosexual, because he never married. He only had his kids around him, and when he died, he left all his money to some of these kids. And then also, in addition to that, the theater groups in England, again, were all male. There were no female actresses. All the actors were male, and they had a reputation of being used for sexual purposes. You can read the literature at the time, one after another, saying these are just enticing, for sexual activity, and that the theaters were just dens of iniquity of homosexual activity. And that was what they were known as. Basically, an actor back then was considered, a boy actor considered a prostitute. And then after the Civil War ended and the Restoration came, and they allowed the theaters to function again after the Restoration, they finally allowed women actresses on stage. And England was the last country in Europe to allow female actresses. And but then, even then, when women became actors on the stage, they were still considered prostitutes. They had the whole tradition came up that the actresses were all prostitutes. And most of the theaters, were considered, again, a place in dens of iniquity. So it all tied together. So like, one thing that reminds me that in the series Downton Abbey, one of the first episodes of Downton Abbey, which was like 1912, the butler of the Earl was being blackmailed. You know why he was being blackmailed? Because another friend of his knew he had been an actor. Ooh, they had to cover that up. He was an actor. This is 1912.
Us actors, we have suffered. Us actor types, we have suffered throughout history some horrible disparagements against us. And a lot of people don't remember that even in this country, in the early days of this country, there used to be signs on inns and bars and saloons that read "No dogs or actors allowed."
I believe it. I mean.
And dogs got top billing. Go figure.
So yeah. So anyway, so the whole theater business back then, even today, a lot of theaters in the bad districts of town, and so that back then was really heavy negative socially view. Actors were just not the proper person to be a friend of or display. So for Oxford to be an actor, he was probably an actor at court with the Queen. He may have done some acting publicly, secretly, who knows? But at court, it was okay. You could be at court and be an actress, and especially in a mask, because Oxford's daughters were actresses in masks. Well, that was okay at court under those circumstances, but not in public, not in the public arena.
I think it's important that our listeners understand how many strange dichotomies that did exist in the Elizabethan era and into the Jacobean age as well. And dichotomies such as that. It was frowned upon to go participate in this art form in the public realm, but it was okay if it was handled inside the private court, performances for the court and court dramas. Masks were, of course, okay because you were concealing your identity, quote unquote. Everyone knew who was behind the mask, but the mask gave you that one degree of separation from the behavior. Mm-hmm. Not unlike the mask of writing under a pseudonym and placing somebody else's face before the public, which is what our contention is what happened with the works of Shakespeare. Meaning that Edward de Vere was hiding behind the mask of Shakespeare of Stratford, or those who created the first folio most likely created that mask of Shakespeare for de Vere to hide behind. And many people point to the Droschet engraving as looking very much like a phony mask, that iconic image that we associate with Shakespeare that is in the cover pages of the first folio. And so to understand how that could be and why that could be, it's better if you understand how these dichotomies existed with regards to masquerade balls and dances where they wore masks. And in the works of Shakespeare, we see examples of that, such as Romeo and Juliet, for instance, where everyone is wearing a mask for the party, but yet everyone knows who they really are. In fact, Tybalt goes to his uncle Capulet and says, look, there's a Montague. So even though Romeo's wearing a mask, everyone knows it's Romeo.
Yeah.
The same thing happens in Much Ado About Nothing, where there's another mask party and people are hiding behind masks, and Benedict is wearing a mask, and Beatrice says things to offend him because he's pretending to be someone else, but she knows it's him, so she says things about him to purposely hurt him because she knows he's trying to pretend to be someone else. So this is a theme that we see in some of Shakespeare's plays. That dichotomy moves into sexuality, like I was mentioning before. They had this sort of Romanesque belief about homosexuality and love between men in their secret realms and behind closed doors and in their bedrooms. But out in the public, they had to suffer this puritanical viewpoint of sodomy is against the Bible, it's a sin, and if you are committing sodomy, the devil is in you, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like Oxford's bisexuality or sexuality was fairly well known, and people didn't really make an issue out of it. That's Oxford's bisexuality seems to be more accepted by Orthodox scholars who believe Shakespeare was the author, more so than Oxfordians. Oxfordian scholars in their biographies of Oxford barely mention his sexuality. They just kind of overlook it. And to my surprise, only one that really brought it up was Joseph Sobran, who made it very clear that Oxford was bisexual. But other books hardly bring up the subject at all. We don't want to talk about that, even though the Orthodox scholars do talk about it. Like in terms of the sonnets, the sonnet, it was not sexual. It was a love for a son, not for a lover. But then when you look at the sonnets, you can see that the homosexual consciousness of the first 126 sonnets is, you can see it in celebration of the young man's beauty, in the obsessiveness of the author's love, and his repeated attempts to define his relationship with the young man in terms of marriage. It has several sonnets talking about in terms of marriage. So I shall live supposing thou art true, like a deceived husband. Let me not their marriage of true minds amid impediments. I mean, that's talking about you want to marry your son. And then many of the poems are immersed in the expressions, again, of obsessive desire and grief in terms of his absence. The author speaks of emotions that typically affect the lovesick, of sleepless nights when the poet's thoughts make a pilgrimage to the beloved, of the poet's a slave to his friend's desire. You talk that way to your son, or being deceived, or sexual dependency. And then, to me, one big issue is the Sonnet 87, where the author says, "Thyself thou gavest." That phrase, instead of a woman, would certainly suggest consummation. Why should the identical clause take another meaning if the recipient is a man? I mean, that's the whole thing. It's like the double standard. Oh, no. This is a love of a father to a son, not to his lover. So even though the writing is right there, that's what I say. Oxfordians kind of reluctant to look at that way. They say, oh no, he was a queen's son, and that goes that this is the two rival interpretations. Was he the lover or was he the son? And that's where you go back and forth on in the Oxfordian movement. And that's not an issue in the Orthodox movement at all. They just think of Shakespeare from Stratford as the author. He could have been bisexual and leave it at that. But they never bring up the fact that Oxford could have been the father of Southampton. And again, that's a big albatross we have in our neck that we have to carry, explaining that issue to other people, and that makes us questions the whole movement, in my opinion.
Well, that is definitely one of the big issues that definitely needs some answering or some deeper scholarship, because I agree, if you look at it on a cursory level as it being Shakespeare of Stratford who wrote these sonnets, then clearly it would have to be some sort of homosexual or bisexual love aspect, perhaps even a love triangle, because it would be impossible for Shakespeare of Stratford to be the father of the Earl of Southampton.
Exactly.
But if you look at it as from an Oxfordian perspective and you say, oh, well, the author is the Earl of Oxford, well, now you have a plausibility that it could be a father to son, that it could be a paternal love that's being discussed rather than a physical love that's being discussed. And that changes the whole realm of the sonnets, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we have to explain these clauses I just explained as to why would you talk that way to your son in terms of such amorous way. And also the way, in my opinion, the sonnets came out in 1609. They seem to have been suppressed. They disappeared. Just a few copies exist. No comments were made of it. Nobody mentioned having the sonnets or about their existence. And then they resurfaced 1640. From 1609 to 1640 is the next time they resurfaced. And when they resurfaced, what happened? They made them all heterosexual. They put sonnet titles that the sonnets were addressed to a woman. They changed some of the pronouns from he to she. I mean, so obviously it was viewed then as being homosexually inclined. And so from 1640 until 1640 to 1780, the sonnets were then republished in their original form. From 1640 to 1780, people thought, oh, these were all sonnets addressed to a woman, because that's the way they were published in 1640. And then when Edmund Malone published them again in the original context, it created a fear. Oh no, Shakespeare could not have been homosexual. And so there's a whole thing, how to address that. And so it tells you how they reviewed at the time the homosexuality of the sonnets. And so it goes back to, so why were they, why were they suppressed? Originally in 1609, because they were viewed as being homosexual. But now that's still
Okay,
changed.
so here's another really big problem then for Stratfordians. Okay, so we have highlighted what the challenge is for Oxfordians, which is to determine what the relationship was between Edward de Vere and the Earl of Southampton. We need to define that relationship as clearly as we can.
Yeah.
I think that Stratfordians also struggle with that issue because they need to try to define the relationship between Shakespeare of Stratford and the Earl of Southampton, which they absolutely cannot do. They can't even prove that those two men knew each other. So on the one hand, if their argument is, well, Shakespeare of Stratford could not have been homosexual, then how do you address the sonnets and some of the other homoerotic aspects of some of the plays, which we'll talk about in a minute? If they argue, and I could see where they could argue, that he definitely was homosexual, and that's why he was forced into the marriage with his wife, Anne Hathaway. That's why he abandoned his wife and children, because he was actually gay and didn't want to be married to a woman and didn't want to be a father. And that's why he abandons his family and leaves for London and doesn't provide for his children to be educated and learn how to read or write. That could be the argument that it was because he was secretly hiding this closeted homosexual tendencies and never really wanted to consummate that marriage. We know that she was much older than him and that she got pregnant by accident. So it could be argued that this older woman seduced the young William Shakespeare and then got pregnant, and basically it was a shotgun wedding, forced him into marrying her, and then he ditches out. So that would support their narrative, but it doesn't answer how in the world could this commoner, no matter how good he was in theatrics, how in the world could he be close enough to an earl to develop a relationship of that magnitude and then write about it for the public consumption without losing his head?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, I agree with you. It makes no sense how he could write all these plays and not be arrested or lose has a nose cut off, his ears cut off, whatever happened to the other authors at the time. Because remember, back then, England was a police state, and everything was censored, and anything that might refer to the Queen in a negative way was suppressed. The authors were locked up, they were tortured, so you have to be very careful as to what you wrote, especially if anything could be interpreted as offending the Queen or her reputation. So we go back and forth on that issue. And I agree, I mean, in terms of Shakespeare Stratford, to me, there's no question, there's no evidence for Shakespeare Stratford ever being, there's no commentary, no innuendos or anything at that time that he was bisexual. There's nothing there to support that. And that's why a lot of the Orthodox scholars say, well, we don't know what to make of all these references to male love in the plays because we don't know their author's sexuality. We don't know Shakespeare Stratford's sexuality.
Let's talk about some of those. Let's talk about some of the homoerotic aspects to some of the plays. What would be the first one you would point to as being the most clearly representative of homosexual or bisexual love?
Well, like almost all the plays. Actually, when I wrote this article, that's 2005, 15 years ago, I've added much more information since then, many more references to the plays in terms of the homosexual elements in the plays. And I'll be writing a book about that. I mean, I'm writing a book that should be out coming maybe in the next year. But there's so many references, and the one that's, well, Orthodox scholars agree that, you have Troilus and Cressida, you have As You Like It, you have Merchant of Venice. To me, Merchant of Venice is the one that's a very powerful one, with love between Antonio and Bassanio. And here, it's very clear, and I've asked many theater actors after the play, I've seen the play, what's your take of the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio? And all of them have said, it was clearly homosexual. And the story there is that they start being together, but Bassanio is a young, broke nobleman. He needs money, so he needs to find a rich wife. So to get her, he has to get money to go there and pretend he's rich. And so Antonio gives him the money to do that. He hasn't even met the woman. Okay, and then he's going to marry her for her money. That's basically what the story is. And then he meets her, and then they fall in love, and then we have the whole situation with the trial. Antonio and Bassanio express their love to each other in public, in front of the wife, who doesn't know. They don't know it's her because she's dressed like a man. She's dressed like the judge. I mean, like the attorney, and so that's just and. That's a very strong escape, but then it's anyway. All the plays have some element of even very subtle references to sexuality or homosexuality in the plays, but they all end up with where the heterosexual marriage is the one that comes out at the end. So it's but up again.
Well, one of the most important aspects of that, I think, is when we're talking about a time period, especially among these people who are noble and who maintain certain titles and holdings to certain land, and having a male heir is of such crucial importance. Even if you're an outright homosexual, you still feel the need to make sure that you have a son to carry on your lands and titles. And so it sets up a situation where homosexual men are taking wives and looking specifically for wives who they hope will be fertile so that they can have a son. And we have instances of certain men, certain noblemen who do get married, their wife has a son, and then they never touch their wives again.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're not really interested in women. They just go through the act of procreation because they need that heir in order to carry on the family name and carry on the title.
Yeah. Like you said at the beginning, the best example of that is King James. But I think you said something at the start, that back then, the word homosexuality did not exist. The word bisexuality did not exist. It was just a sexual act. It was a sodomy or whatever. And so nobody considered themselves as being in that state. It was just a sexual act. So that concept did not exist. The word homosexuality was just invented in the late 1800s by psychologists. So it was very fluid. Back then, sexuality in the plays, sexuality in Oxford's life is very fluid. It was just an act. It was just sex. And so back then, even though if you preferred to have sex with men, you will still marry a woman, have children, like you say, because that was expected behavior for the inheritance, especially if you were the king, like King James. So that's the dichotomy there, that sexuality is not perceived as the way then as it is now, where, oh no, you're gay or you're straight. Even today is such a point where people even reject the idea, oh, you're not really bisexual. I mean, you're just still a closeted gay. You can't accept the fact that you're gay, because a lot of people still today think bisexuality does not exist. Whereas you can see throughout history how many people, Roman emperors, were bisexual. So the first 12 Roman emperors, 11 were bisexual, because back then it was not a stigma. So things have changed with.
Well, I think you're right. I think that's a very important point that you point out, that those labels did not exist until the 19th century. And throughout ancient times, and even through the Renaissance period and well into the Restoration, we didn't have those labels. There wasn't anything called sexuality. There was love and its various forms, and there were physical acts. And it's one of the ways that I think that the gay men of the time were able to overcome any type of stigma, was because to love another man was not frowned upon. To love another man deeply, to have deep affection for another man, was not frowned upon. What was frowned upon was the act of sodomy.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of like, love the sinner, hate the sin kind of a concept, right? It was, well, we don't frown upon this relationship between these two men until it becomes physical. Then it's bestial. Then it has descended into the animal world and not remained in the spiritual world. And that's a big factor of Western religion, isn't it?
Yeah. But even when people knew that King James was sleeping with Buckingham in the same bed, people still kind of look the other way.
Right.
So again, it makes no sense, but that's just reality. And so again, same with the sonnets. I mean, to me, the sonnets very clearly state that the author's in love with Southampton, and there's some clear indications that they had sex, but still, oh no. Like I said, thyself thou gavest. Oh no, that doesn't mean sexual, because it's to a man. Anyway, so there's a double standard interpreting things, and so it goes back to then why was the secret kept after Oxford died? What was the scandal that was so overwhelming that would cause this? And to me, what I thought, 2005, that the main issue was the bisexuality of the author. Well, since then, Alexander Wallace came out with the theory that there's another scandal in the sonnets that I had not realized, and most people had not realized. And the other scandal is that the three-way relationship between the fair youth, the dark lady, and the author produced a child. And that's the scandal that really affected the court. And to me, the biggest evidence that Alexander Wall, which is Alexander Wall's theory, is like Sonnet 130, which is a very, to the dark lady. There was one that says, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Well, he found out that there was a sonnet series called Diela Sonnets, is it called? And that sonnets, they were written to a woman, and the sonnets, basically Sonnet 130 is a response, a rebuttal to the Diela sonnets. And no, not Delia, Delia sonnets, the Delia sonnet, not Delia, the Delia sonnets. And so the Delia sonnets, we talk about this woman in the most elaborate, beautiful terms, and in Shakespeare's Sonnet 130 is a complete rebuttal of the Delia sonnets. And so Alexander Wallace discovered through several means that these Delia sonnets were written by RL, and so he determined RL was an alias for Southampton, and that he wrote these sonnets to Penelope Rich. And so that was, wow. I mean, you read the two sets of the Delia sonnets, and the Sonnet 130 is a complete, clearly rebuttal of those sonnets. And these are sonnets written by Southampton to Penelope Rich. And in addition to that, in Willoughby's Avisa, he says some of the lines in the Delia sonnets under and the person who says those lines is H.W. Henry Rosalie, H.W. So that confirms that H.W. is the author of R.L., the author of the Delia sonnet. So again, it ties it back to that the real reason for the cover-up, ultimately not just the bisexuality, is the fact that Penelope Rich was the mother of Oxford's quote-unquote son by Southampton, and that was crossing the line back then with nobility of casting one illegitimate son as a son of another nobleman and naming him the 18th Earl of Oxford when he was a son of Southampton. But
it's quite possible that happened very often. In fact, we have evidence of other instances where women bore children who looked nothing like the supposed father of the child, and that man accepted that son as his own because he needed an heir so badly, and he didn't care that the heir had actually been fathered by another man, as long as that he could raise that son as his own and pass on his lands and titles to that boy. So that happened probably more often than we think it did.
And thanks for bringing that up. That's a perfect example, because Penelope Rich was married to Lord Rich, and she had 5 children by Lord Rich. And then she had an affair with Lord Mountjoy, and she had 6 children by Mountjoy, but Lord Rich accepted those 6 children as his children. And so if it's perfect with your theory that did happen back then, And then we know that
You're saying Penelope. So a lot of our listeners may not know, especially some of the people who are new to this topic and new to the Shakespeare authorship question. We've thrown around a lot of names and a lot of things out there that their probably heads are spinning right now. Many of them have no clue who Penelope Rich is or how she fits into the equation. Many of them have no clue what the Delia sonnets are, and many of them have no clue at all as to Willoughby, his Avisa. Which is another publication. So those are topics, and so I'm saying them out loud again so that listeners who want to jot those down and do a little Googling and a little researching on their own to see how that all ties together. But I want to try to get out of those weeds for a minute and talk about, so what you just said, though, is that Penelope Rich had 5 children from this guy, 6 children from this guy, and then another child that was passed off as Oxford's heir. So you're saying this woman had 12 children
that survived. She had probably some miscarriages too. So.
At a time where childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. She must have been a powerhouse.
She was a baby factory, correct. She had children almost yearly. So like
wow.
So that's what I can say. And so
she was constantly pregnant.
When you see the birthdays of her children, there's like a 2 years void. And that's exactly where Henry Vere was born, 1593, during that void when she didn't have any children. And we know that she was then very close to Southampton. Look at Southampton's biography. He was obsessed with the Essex family, with Essex and Penelope. And he spent all his life basically with them. So to me, it makes sense that Essex is the rival poet in the sonnets because he spent all his time with Essex. And then, anyway, so that's a discussion, a different discussion. But Southampton, when you look at biography, and that was my presentation in Harvard, how close he was to the Essex family all his life, to the point where he would die with Essex during the rebellion. He was willing. He never turned. He was the only one who did not turn against Essex. And he was willing to die with Essex at the rebellion. He was that dedicated to Essex and that dedicated to Penelope.
Except he doesn't die with Essex.
But
Essex gets.
He was willing to die with Essex.
Essex gets beheaded.
Yeah.
Essex gets beheaded for the Essex Rebellion, for which Southampton ends up being exonerated and gets released from prison by James.
Yeah.
Southampton does end up dying out in the field of battle.
Correct.
Alongside the 18th Earl of Oxford.
Correct.
Because those two become fast friends, tight buddies, and if you look at pictures of the two of them, they look like father and son.
Actually, Brad, I'm glad you brought that up because there's only one there's one portrait of Henry Vere that looks just like Southampton. And it says Henry Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford. And then when you look at the two boys, this more than five, it's not literally the same person. Then you look at all the other portraits of Henry Vere, they look nothing like this one portrait of Henry Vere. Only one portrait makes him look exactly like Southampton. All the other portraits make him look very different. So what happened is that this portrait by Robert Vaughan came out about 1636 after they were both dead, and basically took a portrait of Southampton and called it Henry Vere, and then had the mace across his chest, with the left hand, showing that he was a bastard. That was a very common way to portray bastards. James II's children who were bastards. They were portrayed with the baton across the chest, showing that they were bastards. Everybody knew they were bastards. And so this portrait of Henry Vere, which is a portrait of Southampton with the bastard sign, that's a clear sign. I mean, one more proof could you have that Henry Vere was the son of Southampton.
Okay, but then couldn't people who argue that the sonnets really are a father-son relationship, couldn't they point to that and argue and say that's just more proof that Southampton is actually the son of Edward de Vere, and then thus that would make Henry de Vere the grandson of Edward de Vere, and thus the actual rightful heir to the titles of the Earl of Oxford.
But that, to me, that's a real stretch. I mean, that would assume that in thus Oxford is the father of Southampton. And when you look at history, there is no evidence of that whatsoever. There's not even a rumor at the time of that happening. And then when you look at if Southampton was the son of the Queen by Oxford, back then, as you know, your history, religion was a really important issue. And why would the Queen then place her bastard son, the future king, quote unquote, in the house of strong Catholics? Henry Wriothesley, the second Earl, was in prison for being a Catholic. And then she puts her son in a Catholic family.
It's a perfect way to convert that household.
That makes no sense.
No, wait a minute, John. It's a perfect way to convert that household to Protestantism.
They never did. They remained Catholic. Henry Southampton never became a Protestant until he married into the Essex cousin. He remained a strong Catholic way until then. He was always a Catholic until then. Essex is the one who turned him into a Protestant. And then when you look at the time frame of Elizabeth's life, there are many, many books written about Elizabeth, her biography. And there's no documented time where she could have hid her pregnancy. And then the PTers say, Southampton was born in May or June of 1574. And it's well documented when Elizabeth was in public view, May, June, and July of 15. There's just no time. There's no time. There's no data available. All the evidence that there is contradicts the PT theory. So not only do you have no evidence, the evidence that there is contradicts. Also, the response is, all the evidence is fake. Then that's a real stretch.
Okay, so what if Southampton is not the son of the Queen, but he is the son of Edward de Vere? Is it possible that Edward de Vere could have had other bastard children that did not involve Queen Elizabeth at all?
We know Southampton's birth. We have letters from his father, letters from his mother, from all the courtiers around, all saying who their parents are. All the evidence shows that unless all that evidence is fake, that would be the case. But again, there's no evidence supporting that. All the evidence contradicts that. So you have to say, all the evidence that there is made up. There's evidence as to his birth by several people. And it doesn't make any sense.
Oh, and there would never be anywhere in this entire argument, there would never be any made up evidence. Like the made up evidence that William Shakespeare of Stratford was actually a playwright.
There's no evidence. No. Wait. There's no evidence that William Shakespeare of Stratford was the author during his lifetime. There's no evidence for that at all. Period. But there's lots of evidence that Southampton was the son of his father and the son of his mother. Yes, there is.
Well, let's
to
use a fun term. Let's veer back to the texts of the plays and talk about some more of the references within the plays that you feel are the most homoerotic references. You talked about Merchant of Venice and the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio. What are some of the other relationships between male characters in the plays that you think are ways that Oxford was either serving as an apologist for homosexual behavior or was trying to express his inner feelings? What are some of the other plays and relationships that you would point to?
Oh, yeah. Like I said, there are many examples. Let me look through here. One is the Troilus and Cressida, where many Orthodox scholars believe it or not, that Patroclus and Achilles, says about Achilles and Patroclus. Achilles was the major, Greek, general, and then Patroclus was his lover, and it's very well known that was his lover. And so this only play, basically, where homosexuality is portrayed in a negative way, because a lot of people believe that Achilles represents Essex and Patroclus represents Southampton. So when here in the play, this is Thersites, who's a person, some kind of a leader there, a religious leader. he says when he's talking about Patroclus, and he says, "Prithee be silent, boy. I profit not thy talk. Thou art thought to be Achilles' male varlet." And Patroclus says, "Mere varlet, thou rogue. What's that?" And Thersites says, "Why? His masculine whore." And so that's very clear, that relationship there again. But that's only time portrayed negatively, because as we think Oxford must have been very jealous of Essex, as he was a rival for Patroclus. And then,
but also those aren't characters. Those are not characters created by Oxford. Those are characters from the historical record.
yeah. But
those characters exist from Homer.
Yeah.
And almost every historian believes that relationship between Achilles and Patroclus was truly a homosexual love relationship. So Oxford isn't creating those characters or creating that relationship. He's depicting it.
Oh, yeah.
And in so doing, depicting it in a derogatory way.
Correct.
So I would say that reference is actually counter and antithetical to the idea that Oxford is bisexual or has homosexual tendencies and is trying to express those in a positive way or in an apologetic way. I would say that Troilus and Cressida doesn't count.
Well, see, I disagree with you there, because he presents that relationship throughout the play, and this is just Thersites' reaction to it. And I think Thersites' reaction to it, I think, is Oxford's reaction to Essex. That's how I view that, because all the other plays present it in much more loving terms. That's the only play that presents it in a negative term, because of that relationship between Essex and Southampton, portraying Patroclus and Achilles. That's the reason why I think he brought it up in a negative way. It's still a homosexual relationship. He brings it up, and As You Like It, that back then, yes, all the actors were male. So here we have a situation which is a boy pretending to be a woman who pretends to be a boy, and then her name is Ganymede, and Ganymede was the lover of Zeus. So that's how she goes out to get hold of Orlando, by pretending to be a boy who was pretending to be a girl. So it gets very confusing. Back then, that was just part of the confusion there. So then at the very end of the play, Rosalind, who says at the end, "If I were a woman, I would kiss as many of you as had beards that pleased me," and she goes on from there. So again, it's a big confusion. So what sex who's talking, and the same thing with Twelfth Night. It's the same situation where what's her name? Antonio there, and Sebastian. And Antonio, they're twins. Sebastian and what's her name?
Viola.
And but what's Sebastian's sister's name?
Viola.
Is it Viola? I thought that was
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, so Viola.
Olivia is the love interest, and Viola is the character who disguises herself as a man.
Yeah. Okay. So she disguises herself as a man, and then the Duke, the Earl, there falls. Starts. Even though she's a man, they have a kind of a relationship, and she falls in love with him. And then Antonio, who is clearly one of the few purely homosexual characters in Shakespeare. And actually, when you think about it, Antonio in Merchant of Venice is also one of the few purely homosexual characters in Shakespeare that have the same name. And then there's another play also, which is another Antonio who is also gay. Anyway, so they're
I wonder, do we know if there are any Antonios that were prominent in the life of Edward de Vere? Were there any people in his life who were named Antonio or Anthony or Antony that he encountered or that we know from his letters or from his personal papers or anything like that? That'd be an interesting area of research to get into, because you're right. He does use that name twice for naming two male characters who are older men who have a strong love for a younger man in their lives. And I'm wondering, was there maybe an older man in the young Earl of Oxford's life named Antonio, or perhaps vice versa? Perhaps he had a young man in his life named Antonio, and he was using that as a means of portraying that depiction. But I do think that those are much better examples than the Troilus and Cressida example, because I think in those examples, he is clearly depicting a gray area, as it were, of what love is. And basically, in both of those plays, the male love interest, whether it's Orlando or whether it's Duke Orsino, basically they make it clear that they're loving the person within, not the body.
No, I agree. And that's
Right?
a very good question.
To them, it's not about male or female. It's about the soul. It's about the heart of the person within that they have fallen in love with.
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any Antonios in Oxford's life, but there could have been. I mean, I haven't. I need to look that up too, because that's a very good point. Because I think there's a third play with another gay Antonio in it, and that comes up in the play, and that's can't think. That's what. Anyway, so then I said you can look at in my article, Richard II. And then there's also like just fleeting references to homosexual activity throughout the plays. For instance, in King Lear, just the fool says, I have it here. He says, "He's mad that trusts in the tameness of a wolf, a horse's health, a boy's love, and a whore's oath." Why would he bring up a boy's love? I mean, just it's thrown out there. And then in Henry IV, Part 2, the hostess in her commentary on Falstaff says, "In good faith, I curse not what the mischief he doth. If his weapon be out, he will foin like any devil. He will spare neither man, woman, nor child." Again, just this irrelevant, just off the cuff remarks about homosexual activity back then. And then it goes on to.
Well, I think in that instance, I think what she's saying is he would do it with a snake if you hold it still long enough.
Yeah. And then in Henry V, I mean, you can see that another there in Coriolanus between Adolphus and talking about his erotic love for Adolphus. But anyway, all this elements, and then I have here, according to Stanley Wells, the character, which I don't agree with Stanley Wells, but he says, according to Stanley Wells, the character who has the most homosexually charged line in Shakespeare is Iago, because of his sleeping his dream in Cassio's bed. I don't think that's the most homosexually charged line in Shakespeare, but anyway, according to Stanley Wells, that is. I mean, you can go play after play and find little.
That was one I was going to mention because it is very clear. I mean, Iago says very clearly to Othello, he says, "I lay with Cassio lately."
Yeah.
And in our sleep, he rolled upon me, embraced me tightly, kissed me on the mouth, and called me Desdemona. That's his way of infuriating Othello's jealousy, is to say that while we were asleep, Cassio in his dreams hugged and kissed me and called me Desdemona. That doesn't mean that they were actually having a love affair. It could literally just mean that Cassio was dreaming of Desdemona in his sleep and mistook Iago for a lover, even though they were just, camped out together or bedded down together in the barracks or whatever. So I don't know that it's clear that there's a homosexual relationship there. But definitely it could be construed that way by somebody who's looking for it.
I agree with you. That's why I disagree with Stanley Wells that Iago was the most homosexually charged character in Shakespeare. I don't see that either. But like in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio's kind of crush on Romeo, and you can go down the line as to how all this has been interpreted. You have Proteus, Sylvia, and Valentine. You have again, like we talked about, Sebastian, Olivia, and Antonio. We have Bertram, Helena, Parolles. I mean, we could go down the line of all these encounters where we see two guys who have a very close relationship, and that relationship is kind of dismantled by a woman who shows up in play after play after play. That seems to happen, and so so that's the way I guess Oxford brings up the issue of homosexuality. Because basically it talks about
many of those situations include the element of older male, younger male. Even in the situation of As You Like It, when Rosalind is in disguise as Ganymede, she is referred to regularly by other characters as fair youth or young man. And so it implies that she is younger than Orlando, younger than the other male characters. With Orsino, he's obviously much older than Viola, who is pretending to be a boy. In that play, he takes him on as a page, right?
Yeah.
And totally different situations, too. Rosalind does what she does for the same reason that Viola does, which is women were at risk. They were in fear of being alone as a female, and especially in a foreign land or a foreign forest. And to disguise yourself as a male was to provide an extra layer of protection that you wouldn't be abused or taken advantage of. Yeah. It's not specifically done at first to deceive for any other purpose than self-preservation. Of course, Rosalind, the largest character, the largest female role in the entire canon, of course, she becomes this love guru, so to speak. And then obviously Viola gets caught up in a love triangle against her wishes when Olivia also thinks that she's a male and wants to fall in love with her, which is, one of the great plot lines.
Yeah, it is.
But it does make me think about all of these relationships, these older male, younger male relationships. And then we see the relationship, as you talked about at the beginning of the episode, with regards to Oxford returning from Italy with this young choir boy, and there being this older male, younger male relationship there. Clearly, there's an older male, younger male relationship between Oxford and the Earl of Southampton.
As shown in the sonnets.
And it makes me wonder, looking back then into Oxford's life, at some of the older male influences that he had in his life. I'm wondering, with the mentors that helped educate him and helped refine him, if there may have been any males in that line that we have reason to believe may have introduced Oxford to homosexual behavior.
And unfortunately, we'll never know. I don't think those records exist, but I think it's a very likely situation that you presented, but that's all speculation, but it's very, very probable. Yeah.
I'd be curious to see some research into the lives of some of his early tutors. And even, we know his uncle, Arthur Golding, was a staunch conservative Puritan. Yeah. But as we have learned in modern times, those who sometimes are the most conservative, railing against this type of behavior, are secretly engaging in it in their own bedrooms.
Yeah, we know it doesn't mean, we know it doesn't mean anything.
So that doesn't really tell us anything, does it?
But anyway, one thing I do want to bring up is on this issue, but like Looney himself, in his 18 characteristics of the author, he says that for Oxford, he says one of the characters is Shakespeare's doubtful and somewhat conflicted attitude to women. And so but he doesn't really expand on it. Looney just says it, doesn't say much more about it. Despite he says later on, Looney claimed this one characteristic might afford an explanation for the very existence of the Shakespeare mystery. That's the quote from Looney. He brings but that's all he says about it. And then the whole issue.
Well, that's what, 1920?
1920, yeah.
That's 1920.
Yeah.
So one of the great advantages I think that we have today in our modern scholarship is that the society has, and not completely, there's still work to do, certainly, but I think we have opened up and we have embraced love of all kinds in a much better way than any of those previous centuries could say. I mean, Looney obviously had to be very careful with what he said.
Yeah.
He was writing in a time of very even nearly as puritanical as the Elizabethan era. I think that we're now in a place where we have embraced openly gay couples, where we are embracing gay marriage, where we are accepting that love is between the heart and not between the body. And I think that allows us as scholars to talk about these issues in a more truthful way without having to skirt around them or hide away from them. And I think we're in a place now where we can truly dig into the relationships that Oxford had, including, like I say, is there some evidence? Can we possibly find some evidence that he had older men in his life who had the same types of relationships with him that we are theorizing that he probably had with younger men later on in his life, and that cycle sort of continuing through, not unlike an Achilles and a Patroclus type of situation.
Yeah. I hope you're right, but I still think that there's still a lot of homophobia out there, even within Oxfordians, and they just don't bring the subject up, or they dismiss it, and they go into other issues. Period. You look at biography of Oxford's life by Oxfordians. How many of them bring that up? Hardly any. So there's still an issue out there about accepting the fact that Oxford seems to be bisexual, and which is accepted by like I said, not Oxford, but most Orthodox scholars agree that the author had to have been bisexual, or at least expressed an interest in bisexuality. So why would he be doing that? And I can have a quote here from Maurice Charney, says basically on this issue. Maurice Charney is a strong Stratfordian scholar. He says the issues of the homoerotic in Shakespeare are hopelessly intertwined in academic controversy. Everything seems to come back to the unanswerable question of Shakespeare's own sexual orientation. And that's where the Orthodox scholars are stuck. But that's where Oxfordians are stuck. They kind of disregard it. And then, like Harold Bloom in his famous book talks about the very end, well, not the very end, he says along the same lines that the issue that, let me see if I can find that he says, the human condition Shakespeare keeps intimating is bisexual. So that's where Orthodox scholars are at. That's not where Oxfordian scholars
so then I go
at.
back to what you pointed out very early on in the episode. I'll go back to what you pointed out, which is those terms didn't exist in Shakespeare's time and in Shakespeare's life. Yeah. Nobody was considered heterosexual or bisexual or homosexual. Everyone was considered sexual.
Correct.
And there were rules about the bounds of sexual behavior, but no rules about love and the object of affection. And I think that that's a very classical old world thought, especially when you consider, when we talk about Zeus had his male lover Ganymede. Yep. It goes that far back into ancient culture. When we think about the Roman way of love, and if you look at the plays that are set in Roman times, the men in those plays talk to each other and call each other very commonly their lover. You did love me once, says Cassio to Brutus during Julius Caesar. Is he saying, oh, we used to have sex together? No, he's saying you had an affection for me, a love for me as a human being that I used to cherish, and now I feel that has turned away. So I think that when you look at that we have to get rid of those labels. And I think as scholars, as historians, even as scientists, we don't have the luxury of homophobia. We don't have the luxury of any phobias. We should have open minds to what was the truth without judgment. Because as soon as we place our judgment into it, we are closing ourselves off to what the historical fact must have been or could have been, or what we can discover it to be.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. but I still think that there's still, people are people. There's still racism. There's still homophobia, and I don't think we'll ever get over that completely. I mean, it's still out there. Racism is not accepted socially anymore, but it exists. Homophobia is becoming less and less acceptable, but it still exists. So we have a long ways to go on both those issues. Yeah.
And I think that as Shakespearean scholars, as staunch Oxfordians, we have in our hands the works of the master that help to inform us and teach us the way to find our way out of those human conditions, to find our way out of racism, to find our way out of homophobia, to find our way into the acceptance and love of others in a heart-to-heart way, and setting aside the body-to-body way. And I think that Shakespeare is trying to teach us that through many of his works.
No, that's true. That's true, and not just homophobia, racism, but also like anti-Semitism and Shylock.
Sure,
Shylock,
religious intolerance, intolerance of any kind.
Shylock's portrayed in a very human way. He's not a nice person, but he's portrayed in a very human way. And so all those issues Oxford brought up throughout the plays and the sonnets and the poems. All those issues are brought up by Oxford. Yeah, I agree.
If you look at his characters, you find that those characters that are most intolerant are the ones who tend to suffer the worst fates and the most tragic outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that tolerance of physical love choices, tolerance of religion, tolerance of race, tolerance of different political views is something that we need to embrace, that we need to discover in the works of this master author and learn from the lessons that he tries to teach us through these wonderful plays and these fantastic characters and these wonderful stories. It's been a fascinating conversation, John. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it, and I hope that it has caused them to want to do some additional research. If you haven't already, give us a rate and a review. Go to your favorite streaming source and tell the world how much you enjoy this program so that we can continue to enlighten others. And as we always say, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com. don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.